Animating UI in Godot can be a huge pain, and I know it's a struggle for many of you, but this is changing in Godot 4.7 and in a big way. This new version introduces a new property, offset transform, applied on top of the normal transform, but not forced by container behavior. In this video, I'll explain what changed and how it makes UI animation much easier, and then I'll show you concrete examples of how it works. Let's go. When using containers, the children are being transformed automatically to fit the container. The position, scale, and rotation will be overridden by the container, and this is why in Godot 4 you can't even manually change these values inside the editor or with the animation player. You are prevented from setting these values because they'll be changed the moment the container recalculates their children. This is a big problem when you want to animate because it doesn't give you control. For many of you, it meant using a dummy control node in between the control you want to animate and the container. That way, the dummy gets positioned, scaled, and rotated, but you have control over your target control as it's using anchor and not container behavior. Note that I said the transform would be overridden when the container gets recalculated. This is an important distinction because, in fact, this makes animating control nodes inside containers totally possible with code and without breaking the container behavior. Containers are not recalculated constantly, so you can override the transform. This feels a bit hacky, and this is why Godot 4.7 introduces the new offset transform, which allows to move the node visually without breaking the container behavior. But before showing you this new transform, I just want to show you how you can animate right now before Godot 4.7, because it's useful for all prior Godot versions, even in Godot 3. As I said previously, while you can't edit the transform in the editor and thus not use the animation player, you can totally do it through code, and I do it all the time using tweens. It's gonna be quick, let me show you how it's done. First, imagine a few buttons inside of a container. We want to make them react to being hovered and pressed. Well, we can just do it. This is not a pretty example, and I've exaggerated a lot so you can see it very well. On hover, I tween the scale and rotation, and I undo it when you stop hovering. As you can see, this works fine because the container is not trying to resize the elements. As long as the content is not changing, such as adding an element or removing one, or resizing them, it just works. Another slightly more tricky example, if you want these buttons to appear in the container, you'll see that adding the element and then tweening them is going to be a problem because the container will set the transforms and thus their scale before the tween can kick in. The solution to fix that is either to wait one frame before setting the scale to 0, but you risk seeing the buttons flashing for a frame. Another way is to make them invisible by changing their modulate.a. We use modulate.a because it doesn't trigger the container recalculation, as changing the visibility makes Godot recalculates the children inside the container, because an invisible element doesn't count in a container calculation. So, depending on what you're trying to do, and in more complex situations like a card game like Slay the Spire 2 for example, where elements are repositioned often and have different scale and rotation, this can be painful. Thankfully, with the new offset transform, this is a bit easier now. First, let me show you what the offset transform actually does, and we'll then see 3 examples to see it in action. As I said earlier, the offset transform is applied on top of the transform. It's basically like adding another transform, allowing you to add a position, rotation, and scale. We also have a neat offset transform position ratio, which allows to set the position between 0 and 1, 0 being the original position, and 1 the size of the control. You can actually go past that if you want. Very useful if you want to hide a child inside a container. That sentence is weird. Don't take that out of context. This new transform will not be overridden by the container calculation, so you can set it in the editor and find it intact when running the game. This means you can use it to animate your UI even with the animation player, without having to use a dummy node in between. So, as you can see here, we can easily move, rotate, and scale elements inside the container. Note that you need to enable the transform offset before you can actually modify the values. I still recommend using tweens to animate UI, as it gives more freedom, like adding randomness, but you do you. The first example is with buttons. I have a tween on the button itself to react to hover. The code is not using the transform offset, but the regular scale, and as you can see, it works just fine even in a container. This is again to reinforce the idea that it's possible to animate right now, but if you want, you can use transform offset scale. It does the exact same thing. The actual example is trying to show and hide the button inside the container. With the offset transform, we don't have to care. We can just set the offset transform scale to 0 and our buttons are invisible. The code to animate the buttons is similar in both techniques, simply tuning the children to scale in or out. Note that by default, the transform offset is visual only. It means the input will not register on the visuals if you move your element, for example. You can untick it, and now the input correctly registers where you can actually see your element. This is important to understand, otherwise you might get confused why your element doesn't receive input correctly if you're moving it, for example, using the transform offset position. With the next example, we could have the same problem if we use the scale, as the first frame would override the scale of the children in the container. Thankfully, with the transform offset scale, we don't have to care. I animate the element inside the container similarly to what we've done with the buttons. But on top of that, we can use the transform offset position ratio to misalign them slightly. This is a good example of something that would have been possible to do before, but would have been much harder, especially if it was an afterthought. This last example shows how we can use the various transform offset properties to handle cards like you would in Slay the Spire. The main point here is that we can simply rotate the cards depending on where they are in the container. I simply map their index to a rotation between minimum angle and maximum angle. The problem we have is that the cards won't overlap because they have a minimum size and the container uses that to place them. To make them overlap, we could use the new transform offset position or position ratio to move them where we want, but we would have to do some calculation, knowing how far we should move them compared to the center. While it's not terribly difficult, it still requires some manual work, and it will make animating the movement of everything a little bit more difficult. In my opinion, in this case, we still need to do the trick we were doing before, which is to use a dummy node at the root of our card. This dummy node is going to be used only to let the container spread elements. Basically, when changing the custom minimum size of this dummy node, the container is forced to recalculate position. This trick is cool because we still get the automatic calculation from the container, but we can make it more smooth by animating the custom minimum size. In this example, I tween the minimum size from 0 to the desired size when the card is added, and I do the opposite when the card is removed. I also increase the minimum size when the card is hovered. This results in smooth motion when we interact with the deck, and for free because we don't have to calculate anything. It would be possible to do the same using the new transform offset, but we would have to basically do the same kind of calculation the container is doing, which would defeat the purpose. Another point to take into consideration is because we have this dummy node in between the card and the container, we don't have a direct correlation between the actual size of the container and the size of the element. In this particular case, it doesn't matter because we want the cards to be a certain size and we don't really want to remove them. In other situations, you might want to resize precisely the element depending on the container. This can still be done by just reacting to the resized signal of the dummy node and resizing your actual content accordingly. I guess this example shows you that no matter what, you have to adapt to the tools you use depending on the use case, and sometimes you have to code some stuff. The final thing I want to talk about is how this allows more destructured look while using containers. Think Persona style UI, for example. While in many cases it might be easier to just use anchors to achieve a very destructured look, you might still find it useful to make things a little less straight. This is very useful for some style of UI that should look more hand-drawn, horror-y, or cartoony, for example. Make sure to remember the input setting we talked about earlier, as you don't want an element to not be clickable because you moved it using the offset transform position. These videos are made possible by my supporters on Patreon. I want to thank them for supporting my work, and if you want, you can join my Patreon too, it really helps. Check out the link in the description. As you can see, the new transform offset is really cool. It's going to make animating with tweens a bit easier, it allows you to use the animation player directly without any dummy nodes in between, and finally, it also unlocks more destructured UI thanks to the ability to rotate, scale, position nodes directly. I hope you found this interesting, and maybe we even learned about animating UI without this new feature. I have more tips and tricks for UI coming if you're interested, so please let me know in the comments. And if you're really struggling with that and you want to work with me, I have consulting sessions and I do freelance for Juice and UI, so don't hesitate to hit me up, link in the description. And if you want to support me further, check out my games on Steam and consider joining the Patreon. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!